We're going to talk about the times in Scripture where individuals' names are called. Not once, but twice. Names that are called twice. And as you have already figured out from Jerry's reading, we're with Samuel today. Last week, remember, it was Martha. Samuel today. Let's talk about a man as we begin this. Let's talk about Elkanah. Elkanah is a man that's rarely mentioned by preachers. Rarely do Christians who read their Bible say anything about Elkanah. Elkanah was a Hebrew or Jewish man that lived in Ramah, which is located in the hill country of northern Palestine. Elkanah was married twice. He had two wives, Peninnah and Hannah. Now, of course, God never intended to condone the practice of polygamy, right? Jesus said from the beginning, God did not create marriage to be a plural marriage. It was to be one man, one wife, a relationship that would last as long as both of them lived. But there was a time in the history of mankind that polygamy was practiced, and for a lack of a better phrase, God turned his head for a while, but he said it had not been so from the beginning. Do you remember the story of Jacob, who had two wives? By the way, ladies, did those two women get along? Did they get along? Not so much. They were jealous of each other. Well, Elkanah had two wives, and there was a problem. One of his wives had children. We don't know exactly how many, but she had at least two sons and two daughters. But his other wife, Hannah, had no children. And so there was a jealousy there, particularly on the part of Peninnah, who made fun of her sister wife to the point that the sister wife, Hannah, cried a lot. Do you get the picture, folks? But it's interesting to me that it says Elkanah loved Hannah. Why in the world did he marry the other one? I don't know. But there's something else about Elkanah. He was a very religious man. And as far as all we know, Elkanah was a godly man. And one of the things that he did regularly was to go to the place of worship. They didn't have Saturday worship every Saturday, but they had times of the year that they went up to Shiloh, where the Ark of the Covenant was kept, where the priest of God lived, and there they offered the sacrifices under the law of Moses. Elkanah went every year. He took his wife Peninnah and her children. They were given appropriate sacrifices. He brought his wife Hannah, but she had no children. But he doubled what he gave her. And they went up to Shiloh, and they made the sacrifices every year. And undoubtedly they stayed for several days to conclude all of the things that needed to be done to worship God. On the day that we're going to be talking about was one of those days they went up to Shiloh. And Penina really made life difficult for Hannah. The scripture said she's been crying, and then she went off by herself and she started praying. Now, you know, she prayed like some of you do. Her lips kind of moved, but she never said anything. Her prayer was from the heart. And she prayed to God that she would have a son. And in that prayer, now ladies, listen to this. In that prayer, she made a vow. Now let me paraphrase it for you. It's in the first chapter of 1 Samuel. She made a vow. She said, Lord, if you'll give me a son, I'll give him back to you and to your purposes. The scripture says the whole big family went back home to Ramah. And in the appropriate time, Hannah was expecting a child. When that child was born, it was a boy. She named him Samuel because I've asked him of the Lord. The next year, or the following year, where it was time to go up to Shiloh, Hannah said to her husband, I'm not going to go. I'm going to stay home with Samuel until he's weaned, and then I'll go and turn him over to the priest to rear him as a servant of the Lord. And that's what happened. Now, ladies, I want us to be true to Scripture. The Scripture says when she weaned him, when he became a little boy, able to survive on what we might call solid foods, they went up to Shiloh. I don't know how old he was. The scripture uses the word young, very young. They went up to Shiloh, and Hannah turned her little boy over to the priest, Eli. And she went back home without him. Mamas, I want you to think about that. What the scripture says is that she saw him every year. You mamas that had a little boy or a little girl just weaned, and you turn him over or her over to a priest and you visit him or her once a year? What kind of woman is Hannah? She went back home, and the Lord continued to bless her. She had sons and daughters after that. Let's look at Samuel now as a little boy. He's in the area that we might call the temple area, but it was the area where the Ark of the Covenant was kept. That was the most sacred thing among the Jewish people. By the way, there are men, as I speak, still looking for it. It contains some of the most famous and precious religious artifacts the world has ever known. And it was there. And the priest Eli had the responsibility of protecting it and doing what God had instructed him to do in relationship to it. And here's this little boy. The scripture says he waited on Eli. Kind of like a gopher, as we sometimes describe it. And he grew. He grew up. He became a teenager. But his mama saw him every year. And when she came, she'd made him a new coat. Now, it's important for us to know all of that, to appreciate what happened next. One night, Samuel was sleeping somewhere, probably very near the Ark of the Covenant, and he heard a voice. And the voice said, "Samuel." And he got up and he ran into the next room or wherever Eli was sleeping and said, "Here am I. You've called my name. What do you want?" And Eli said, I haven't called your name. Go back to bed." It happened a second time. And Samuel ran in there, and Eli responded as he did the first time. It happened a third time. Same event. Finally, Eli understood something. He said, "Go back to bed. And if it happens again, say, 'Lord, I'm here.'" Jerry read that verse. Now here we have a boy. By the way, the scripture still calls him a child. And the voice called out, "Samuel, Samuel." And he responded, "Lord, here am I." Now, there's a whole lot more to this story that we could continue for at least 2 more hours. But this morning we're only interested in the things that we've just described. There are some very great and important lessons to be learned from this. Let's look at them. Not all of them, but just a few. The first lesson that we need to learn from this is that children are a great blessing from God. Children are not a new car. Children are not a fine meal or a great football ticket. Children are a great blessing from God. God created the family. A family where there is a father and a mother. And together they can create a living soul that will never die. And where does that living soul come from? From the God of heaven. You know, there are men and women who are endowed with a great amount of money, and so they give that money to build a fancy new school building or a new apartment complex or so forth. I worked one time in one of those buildings, and there was this plaque on the outside that this building was built by the funds given by a husband and wife, and the date was 1924. That building's gone today, and the plaque has disappeared. But when a child is born into a family, they're going to create a soul that will never die. Hannah is one of the great women of faith. She understood, Lord, you give me a son, and I'll give him back to you. I want to nail this real strongly. The giving of children is a great blessing, but with the great blessing comes great responsibility. The responsibility is the rearing of those children, as the Apostle Paul put it, in the admonition of the Lord. Every city I've gone to in the last few years, and you watch the local news, there's been shooting in our city. I flipped the TV on for just a minute last night. There's been a shooting in Florence, Kentucky. 4 people are dead. 3 are in critical condition. There are fights in the street. Schools have to be paroled. Somebody said, what's wrong with America? Largely what's wrong with many places in America is, and with many children, is there are no parents. Particularly, there's no father. Our son, Danny, is the school principal. And he says almost half of his children have no live-in father. Children are left to themselves. The book of Proverbs says a child left to himself is painful to a father and mother. Now, we're not going to have any more children in our family. A whole lot of you are grandparents or great-grandparents. I got a little great-granddaughter that I've only seen once or twice. She's a pretty girl. Looks an awful lot like her great-grandfather. And I looked at the photograph of her the other day and I thought, I hope her mama and daddy raise her in the admonition of the Lord. Children are precious. Second thing this story tells us of the power of parents to make great servants of God. We can talk about this over and over again, but it doesn't diminish the truth. Hannah wanted her little boy to be a servant of the God of heaven. She only had him for a few years. He learned to talk and he learned to walk while she had him. But he got a background. He got an understanding. There is a God. And He's made us. And we're going to see Him someday and answer. there was another little boy that I want to remind you of. He was born to a godly mama and daddy. But they knew because of the situation where they lived that he was going to be murdered. So they hid him 3 months. And then they made it possible for Pharaoh's daughter to find him. Remember Moses? And Pharaoh's daughter said, I need a babysitter. And the babysitter was chosen, and it just happened to be his real biological mother. And as a baby growing up, Moses' mother laid a foundation in the heart of this little boy who lived in this sprawling mansion, whose grandfather was Pharaoh. And when it came time, Moses made a decision. He chose to suffer with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season. Who do you credit that to? There's a mama there who made a difference in a little boy. Hannah didn't have her little boy but just a few years. She put the background to what it takes. And then she sent him to Eli. Eli was God's chosen priest. We'll talk more about Eli in a minute. Parents set the foundation. I've told you this story before, and it still breaks my heart to say it today. A beautiful young lady, I don't know, she's probably 22, came into my office one day. She was part of the congregation where I was, and she was about to get married to her elementary school boyfriend. She'd been wanting to marry him for 15 years, I think. But anyway, she said, Brother Fenton, I'm scared to death. I don't know how to be a mother, and I don't know how to be a wife. I'm scared. And I don't know how a husband is to treat his wife. I didn't have a daddy. And my mother, well, she was around sometime. Doesn't that break your heart? Child needs a daddy and he needs a mama, or she. Let's stop thinking about Samuel for a moment and turn our attention to Eli. Eli was from the priestly family that God had selected to be the priest. Eli seems to be a very complicated man. He did the services that God had asked to be done by a priest. He had 2 boys of his own, Phinehas and Hophni. But there was a problem. Those boys were disrespectful to their daddy to start with. Whether or not Eli had trained them or not is questionable. But they became the servants of their father in terms of their service, supposedly to the Lord. Now, this is something Christians don't do. Under the old Jewish law, when people like Elkanah came to worship and offer sacrifices, the priest was to receive a portion of the sacrifice for his own welfare. In other words, if an animal was to be sacrificed, a part of that animal was to be given to the priest. And it wasn't a large portion. If a portion was to be boiled, then they had a program where you dipped in a hook and whatever it came out, that's what the priest got. And no more. But these brothers told these worshipers, give me this, and if you don't give it, I'll take it. In other words, that was their way of being profitable and eating well and a whole longer list. These same boys were sexually immoral with the women that came to offer sacrifices. Now Eli heard all of the complaints of the people about what his sons had done. And he went to them and he told them, this is not appropriate. You're not respecting, or as the King James Version uses it, you're not honoring God. Because God didn't say that's what you're supposed to do. You're to take a portion of it. They had no fear of God. They were corrupt, they were dishonest, and disrespectful. And Eli told them that. But it seems apparent that he could have done something about it. The scripture doesn't speak to that. But he understood that his sons were disobedient and disrespectful, and he acknowledged that to them. But they paid no respect to their daddy. And by the way, we didn't even speak about respect for daddy, did we? You know, Eli put his boys before God. He loved those boys undoubtedly. They were wicked and cruel men, but they're his boys, right? How many times have I heard somebody say about their son or daughter, they've done something really bad, but they're mine? Yes, they're yours, but we don't dare put them before the Lord. That's what Eli did. And because of that and his disobedience, Eli is going to lose his boys, both of them, on the same day. I've known parents that have lost two children the same day in a fire or car wreck or something. Does that hurt? It hurts more than any of us can appreciate. And then Eli's going to lose his life. But the important thing for us to remember is, here's this boy, don't know his years, when God called, he was ready to go to work. Children are important. Children need to be trained by their parents to be loyal and faithful to a God they don't understand. Those of us that have the responsibility of teaching them otherwise, away from their parents, have the same responsibility. How many of you know how old Eli was? Anybody? How old was he? 98 years old, right. When the Jews were in battle with the Philistines, at first the Hebrews won the battle, and then after that the Philistines attack again. And while they were in that battle, they captured the Ark of the Covenant. I don't know if I can express to you this morning how devastating that was to the Jews. That was their most precious thing. And here the Philistines captured it. What did they do when they got it? Well, first of all, they were afraid of it. But we don't know what they did to it, but that's not what's important. The Jews lost something that day, and it broke their hearts and their enthusiasm. Wonder who was responsible for the protection of that? Two boys. Who were they? Hophni and Felix. Not Felix. Yes. They were killed. A runner ran back to Shiloh to tell the people there, including Eli, what had happened. And it's interesting what that message was. The messenger said, well, the battle's been lost. That's bad news. Secondly, Eli, your sons are dead. That's personal bad news. But when Eli heard that the ark had been captured, he was sitting on a fence. Now, by the way, when you're 98 years old, don't sit on a fence. Oh, what did I say? 98. He fell backwards and broke his neck. But you know something? Out of this whole story, there's a beautiful picture that we haven't painted and we don't have time for. The beautiful picture is summed up in the idea, the life of Samuel. That man lived for many years, ruled over Israel, and all of his movements, all of them, were God-driven. He did what God said. Do you know Samuel is mentioned in the Hebrew Hall of Faith? Do you know that Samuel's mentioned in one of Peter's sermons? Samuel is one of the great examples of faithful, godly men. And where did it start? In the house of Elkanah. Samuel, thank you. You've listened patiently, and I appreciate that. It's very important that we become a Christian if we're not. I think most of us in this room have done that. And when we rise out of that water grave at baptism, man, it's good to see the smiles on their faces. If you need to respond, do so now while we stand and sing.